which is basically applied psychology. And the title of the talk today is The Impact of Discrimination on the Reading Motivation Achievement of African American Adolescent Students. I know that I speak with a distinctively American accent, and I also tend to speak very quickly. So if you'd like me to slow down, just motion like this. That'll work.
I request that you slow down from the beginning.
Okay. that's why I asked you right off the bat. Right, and so as mentioned, this is a proposed study that I'm hoping to do data collection on next school year. So that would be fall 2017, spring 2018. So I have not done the study yet. So here's a roadmap for where we're going to be going today. First, I'm going to talk about my personal motivation for doing the work that I do. And then I'm going to give a lot of context, since I'm going to be talking about the American public school system. I'm going to talk about the American racial achievement gap and two theories that I think could potentially help us address the racial achievement gap, which are stereotype threat and reading motivation. After situating my interest in those two theories, I'm going to talk about my research questions. And then I'm going to move into my proposed study and talk about where I see the work moving forward. So to start off with my personal motivation, this is a student of mine that I taught when I graduated from college. I did a program called Teach for America, where high-performing students from elite schools work in low-income communities of high poverty with struggling students. And this is one of my students. His name is Mr. Clavius, and when he started with me, he was about a year and a half behind in schooling, in reading specifically, and he grew 2.5 years in our 1 year together when I taught him in 5th grade. And in our end of the year conference, I asked him, why do you think that you made so much growth? Because he did so much better than many other students who grew, but not that much. And he said, I'll always remember, I just really want to read now. And so a lot of what motivated me to go to graduate school and study the things that I studied is trying to figure out what are the roots of this motivation that kind of pushes students who historically struggle to dedicate themselves to learning and grow. How am I doing? Am I speaking too quickly still, or should I slow down? Okay. Great. So to situate a little bit of the American context, 1983 is an important year because it's when The Nation at Risk came out. And A Nation at Risk was an educational report ordered by then President Ronald Reagan, and it really shook the American educational system to its core. The report found that K-12 American students, so that's kindergarten through 12th grade, so pre-college, had fallen dramatically behind, both in comparison to previous cohorts of students and also students in similarly developed countries internationally. So the US was seeing that it was last in many of the developed countries in terms of its students' math and reading proficiency. And so this report is very important because the urgency of it shapes much of the accountability and standards-focused educational reform that's been the movement in the United States since then. So in 2016, I would say that our nation is still at risk when it comes to education, and that's particularly true when it comes to our adolescents struggling readers. So according to 2015 National Association of Educational Progress data, which is a nationally representative test that cohorts of 4th, 8th, and 12th grade American students take, they found that nearly 2/3 of American 8th and 12th graders scored below proficiency in English, with nearly a quarter unable to meet basic. And so basic would mean that you have a very simple understanding of the grade level expectations for 8th and 12th grade, and proficient would mean that you're on the path to be able to do something like go to college. So it is really alarming that even now we have almost 2/3 of our students not on the path to be able to succeed in college. And for me, one of the largest issues with this is that you see when you zoom in on who is underperforming, that it's disproportionately students of color, specifically African American students, Hispanic American students, and Native American students. So in this same 2015 data set, we see that while 44% of white students and 54% of Asian students score proficient or above, only 16% of African American graders scored proficient or above. So African American students are way overrepresented in the students that are under underperforming in relation to grade level, and very much underrepresented for students who are on the track to be able to go to college. And so when we think about what does this mean, to not be proficient in either grade, what does that mean when students are going to high school? Sean Reardon, who is a statistician, an educational statistician at Stanford, found that on average, African American students are entering high school with literacy skills that are 3 years behind their Asian white counterparts, and that low-income students are entering high school with literacy skills that are 5 years behind their high-income counterparts. And when you think about the fact that African Americans are disproportionately poor in the United States as well, the confluence of these two issues means that a large proportion of K-12 African American students are very much struggling. And just to situate why this is important, it's not just about numbers, it's really about the fact that literacy achievement has a very robust association with critical life outcomes like income, criminality, and human health. And these really underscore how crucial it is that we illuminate the roots of these persistent disparities and confront them. So, two interesting theories that I think could help us target the issues of particularly struggling readers in the African American community are stereotype threat and reading motivation. I think that these two theories provide us a strong piece of what we can do, but they are somewhat incomplete, and I hope that my research long term will help kind of complete those theories. So stereotype threat I wanted to explain because I think it's a very compelling, very interesting phenomenon. And it's a psychological phenomenon wherein a member of a group that's commonly stereotyped as unintelligent or unsuccessful feels added anxiety about test or activities that will show they fulfill that stereotype. And this anxiety is thought to kind of limit their performance. So this has been found in the case of African American students, but also in the case of women with math and sciences and different other marginalized groups within the American academic landscape. So the seminal paper on this work was from Claude Steele and Josh Aronson. It came out in 1995. And they explored the impact of stereotype threat on the intellectual performance of white and African American Stanford University undergraduate students that were asked to answer verbal standardized test questions. And it's important to notice here that before I move into what the experiment showed, that Stanford University is one of the best universities in the United States, so it wasn't even that they were working with students who were generally behind. These were some of the best white and African American students from across the country, and some of them found that they were. So just to walk through the experiment, in 3 of the 4 tests in the overall study, students in one condition were told the test was a simple problem-solving activity, and in the other condition they were presented with a test as a diagnostic test of intellectual ability. So in one, they were saying, okay, we just want you to complete some questions to help us collect some data. And in the other, they were saying, we want to take this test as a diagnostic to see how intelligent you are and how good you are at these types of questions. And so in all 3 of these 4 tests of the original study, African American students in the diagnostic conditions had significantly lower performance, both in comparison to African American students that were in a simple reading problem-solving activity condition and white students in both conditions. So it wasn't that you saw this persistent gap between African American and white students, it was specifically when the African American students were told that it was a test of their intellectual ability that their performance was depressed. In another element of one of the 3 tests, students were also primed with stereotypes. So before they took the test, they had to answer some questions about common stereotypes about African American students. And this made their performance even worse and caused them to do things like work more slowly, answer less questions, and report higher rates of anxiety about performance, and also make more excuses about their performance. So they're more likely to say, I was really tired, I didn't get much sleep last night, I wasn't quite sure what the questions were asking, and so we were seeing that happening in one of the tests. And lastly, I think this one is really interesting too. The last of the 4 studies that they did in the original study, students were just asked to write their race before they took the test, and even this depressed the performance of the African American students. So not even being told that it was a diagnostic, just being told to write your race in addition to your name and your class year on the test made them do worse. And I thought it'd be helpful just to show these 2 graphs from the original paper. So in the non-diagnostic condition, there is not a significant difference between the black test scores and the white test scores. But in the diagnostic condition, you see that the black test scores drop and are both significantly lower than the white test scores, but also significantly lower than the black students in the non-diagnostic condition. And this is the last study that I was mentioning, which is with the race priming. You see just having to write your race before taking the test created this significant drop in problem solved and also ultimately test score, while when there was no race prime, the scores were essentially parity. So, like I said, I find this really compelling when we're thinking about why we're seeing this huge academic achievement gap between African American students and particularly their white counterparts. And so, but with potential drawbacks of this theory and the work on it so far and where I see the work going, while stereotype theory has been consistently replicated and provides a useful mechanism to explain why some racial differences in achievement emerge, research is focused primarily on secondary controlled lab settings, which isn't necessarily directly transferable to K-12 schools. So a lot of the research has been done in social psychology, where they're doing things in labs with college students. And the controlled lab 1 hour experiment is not the same as a student in a K-12 classroom every single day of the year. And so we're not entirely sure about how the theory is transferred. And then I think also with the sharp increase in focus in high stakes testing and accountability in the time since the paper was published. So with things like No Child Left Behind in the United States, which was passed in the early 21st century, where schools are being closed and students are being held back because of their end of year testing scores. There's potentially even more stereotypes taking place because there's an amplified testing pressure. And so I think that the high stakes testing environment that we have in the United States educational system is part of the urgency behind why we need to consider how stereotype threat manifests itself in the public school kindergarten. So moving on to another theory that I think is interesting, kind of adds some of the pieces that stereotype threat is missing, but it's still incomplete, is reading motivation. So I think this is another theory that can help us push forward the work to close the racial achievement gap in literacy between white and black students in the United States. So reading motivation is the brainchild of Alan Wakefield and John Jeffrey from the University of Maryland, for both educational psychologists. And for this theory, the authors took aspects of common theories of academic motivation, like goal orientation theory and expectancy value theory, and applied them to reading specifically. And ultimately that was built around 3 important constructs. The first is self-efficacy belief, so confidence in reading, in your own reading, how good you think you are of a reader. The next is intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and goals. So whether you really enjoy reading, which is intrinsic and extrinsic, so whether you're reading, you're motivated to read because of grades or because of your parents or because you're worried about getting in trouble. And the last is the social aspects of motivation, which has a little bit to do with classroom environment and peers pushing other students to read. So in terms of work that's been done with the reading motivation, it's generally measured using the motivation to read questionnaire. And the body of research that has been used as questionnaire and also used as theory has consistently linked reading motivation to reading achievement. So we're seeing a clear connection between students' motivation to read and their ultimate performance at end-of-year tests, comprehension exams, and things like that. And in terms of item analysis of what is contributing the most to achievement, they're seeing that intrinsic motivation and self-efficacy are the most frequently associated with reading and achievement. So in terms of potential drawbacks and next steps for reading motivation, while I do think it provides an understanding of one of the mechanisms that impacts reading achievement, its body of research rarely explores potential race and socioeconomic differences. It's been very much focused on theory and some gender differences, but they're not related to socioeconomic status and race. And I also think there's a general lack of understanding within the theory about how classroom environment and practices, as well as students' other contexts, can impact their reading motivation. So other larger theories of motivation take into account students' home life, school climate, and thinking about motivation, but reading motivation doesn't do as much So for me, where I see the pulling together these theories and pushing them forward is that in both stereotype threat and reading motivation, there's a clear need for research that considers students' learning context. So thinks about the K-12 system, but also thinks about what's happening in classrooms, what's happening in the world around students that's impacting their motivation. I think the stereotype threat needs to be expanded to the K-12 setting, as I mentioned. They also need to consider how students' own personal experiences with discrimination can amplify stereotype threat. So obviously, the students who were struggling in the original study, yes, sometimes they were primed with stereotypes, but those stereotypes were particularly salient to them because they've heard them before, they've experienced them before. And we haven't really contextualized what those experiences or the severity of those experiences mean for the severity of stereotype threat. And with reading motivation, I think it's very important to explore potential subgroup differences, particularly since stereotype threat suggests that racial differences in self-efficacy exist, which is an important element of reading motivation. So we really need to just dive into, if we know that African American students are less likely to feel self-efficacy than white students, how can we better understand how their reading motivation may differ from white students, even if they're in the same classroom? So this takes me to my research questions, and again, this is for a study that I proposed that I hope to do some data collection on next year. So I'm still in the process of developing these and working on them with my advisor. So the first is, how does the discrimination that students experience in school and in larger society impact the reading motivation of each student? Next I have, how do race and socioeconomic status, as well as more typical composite measures of perceived discrimination, moderate the relationship between reading motivation and reading achievement? And how do African American students conceptualize their own reading motivation and experience with discrimination, and how do they see those impacting their achievement? So in terms of the participants, I'm going to be working with 7th grade students in 2 large middle schools in diverse districts outside of Greater Boston, which is where Harvard is. The schools are predominantly white. They have pretty large minority populations, particularly African American and Latino. So that's part of the reason why I chose these schools. And so for my methods, I'm going to be using a concurrent nested mixed methods approach. So I am not a statistician or an economist, much to my father's sadness. I will be doing a little quantitative analysis and also some qualitative data collection as well. And so what concurrent nested mixed methods means just means that we're doing quantitative data collection and qualitative data collection at the same time. And for me, the qualitative collection is going to be nested within the collection of data at the beginning and end of the school. So in terms of the quantitative elements of my study, I want to understand and model how different indicators of reading motivation and perceived discrimination relate to each other in reading achievement. So I'll do this by administering the motivation to read questionnaire, which I mentioned earlier, and the Iowa tested basic skills, which is a common reading comprehension and achievement measure that we use in educational settings in the United States, and perceived discrimination scales at the beginning and the end of the 2017-2018 school years, and this will go to all students. A note about the perceived discrimination scales, I'm going to be using 3 of them. One of them is mostly about school climate, so whether or not a student perceives their school climate as one that discriminates against other people. Another will be about whether students feel like they experience discrimination themselves. I think it would be interesting to see students who perceive discrimination but don't feel like they experience it, and how that differs by different races or even just by different levels of achievement. And the last scale is just about everyday discrimination outside of school, because again, students are bringing a lot of their experience outside of school into the classroom, and we need to contextualize those as well. I'm going to do a path analysis of the indicators of reading motivation and discrimination on reading achievement, and explore race, socioeconomic status, and personal values of discrimination as moderators. I'd be interested to see, for example, if an indicator like self-efficacy is mediated by certain aspects of discrimination, given what has been found about stereotype threat beforehand and how that comes to these values. So in terms of my qualitative data collection, I would only be doing this with African American students, because the group of students I want to really focus on and see how they're conceptualizing their own experience with discrimination and motivation and these things. So representative sample of students to collect data on. I would conduct 3 semi-structured interviews with students at the beginning, middle, and end of the year. And semi-structured just means I would come with a protocol of questions I wanted to ask, but I wouldn't be forcing every single question. So if students veered off base, I would allow that to happen in order to collect data and build a research relationship. I would observe students within their classrooms at 3 time points of the school year. And after the observations and interviews, I would do a thematic coding analysis of interviews and observations to seeing what general kind of conclusions I was seeing. So in terms of future directions, like I said, I hope to collect this data in the 2017 and 2018 school year, if not the year after. It depends on a couple different things. And I do hope that my work on this question specifically will illuminate the nuance of the academic impacts of discrimination on African American students. Oftentimes in educational policy in the United States, we approach African American students with a very deficit perspective and don't try to contextualize the reasons why they have historically struggled, but instead blame it on the students or their communities. And I want to just add more nuance to that conversation so we can have more actionable things to work with than just, well, those kids just can't learn. And longer term, I hope to do research that provides crucial and currently lacking empirical evidence that bolsters efforts to include academic information to help buffer against the psychological impacts of discrimination. So those are things like culturally responsive teaching and positive development in literacy classrooms, and I'd say in American educational classrooms more broadly. Happy to talk about either of those in more depth in the questions section, which leads us to that.
Thank you very much, Kristia. And as you have noticed, even though she was really fast, but the presentation, the slide was made in such a way that the keywords were highlighted bold with the different colors. So for those who have my classes, they can notice the similarity. So you can have the possibility now to ask questions. Am I allowed? Yes, of course. They get between Wantchekons. Okay, please. No. Maybe you start with.
Just to put it in context, I'm not sure everyone understands what K means when you talk about K to 12.
Kindergarten to 12th grade, so when students enter school around the age of 5 or 6 until they're ready to graduate and go to college when they're around 18.
The equivalent of primary school.
Yeah, primary.
College meaning university.
Yeah.
Yes, Vivian.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I spent most of my college years working at a literacy center where I was working with mostly African American and Latino students who were struggling with their reading. And what I found was that when the reading material was less, I would say more relevant to them, they were more motivated. And I was wondering if you were thinking or have thought about incorporating, sort of studying whether the actual material that is available to these students is just so irrelevant and they feel so isolated from it, and that prevents them from, achieving as much in their reading. Is that something that
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned at the end, I think long term, what I'm trying to do is provide empirical evidence to support the use of culturally responsive teaching in school. So that's texts and materials and practices that really resonates with students that come from different cultural backgrounds and the standard middle-class white American background. And unfortunately right now, the way that that's seen in policy is kind of like, oh, it makes people feel good, but it's not actually important. And so I think that by disentangling some of the mechanisms through which we can actually prove that this impacts achievement, then it's more likely that we can have larger policy initiatives to include cultural responsive teaching, particularly for those struggling students from marginalized communities.
Very much. Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation. I just want to find out what limitations and ethical considerations do you envisage in carrying out this study?
So one thing, especially in
What was
regards,
the question? Sorry.
she asked what the limitations.
limitations and ethical considerations.
So, one thing that's Boston is a city of immigrants largely, so a lot of the African American students are actually Haitian or refugees from various African countries. So there is the English as a second language piece. I'd have to really think about whether I wanted to separate immigrant groups who are also like in the process of learning English and therefore on a different track and taking different tests, or just focus on purely African American students who their first language is English, they just struggle to learn to read in it, so that's definitely one limitation. I also think that with the perceived discrimination piece, that'll be a more difficult measure to convince schools to give. In the United States, we don't like to talk about racism a lot, and schools wouldn't necessarily want to have it published or to know even that a lot of their students perceive the school climate as hostile or discriminatory. So that's definitely something I'm trying to build those relationships now so they can see how it can be helpful for those students, for them to really know that data. And then in terms of ethical considerations, I think my advisor just had something pretty similar pass through the Harvard IRB with pretty quick review, so I don't think that there are any large issues. I know that if long-term I wanted to evaluate a curriculum, then there's always the issue of if you know something works, how long do you wait before you give it to the other students? Especially if we're talking about students that are 2-3 years behind, and every single year counts. How do we kind of balance not giving all these students, we're not sure it works yet. So I know that that's something I have to think about going forward, but for this study, I think I'm pretty safe in terms of the ethical questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask, did you in your study consider the gender issue? Because maybe the female will have different characteristics from the male.
Yeah.
So we do consider that in your study.
And if you could bring that up, I would definitely want to have gender as a control. I know that generally there have been a lot of studies of reading motivation between boys and girls tend to be more motivated to read than boys. So that is something that I would like to not explicitly explore, but definitely account for in my analysis.
Is there an aspect of public sector school or private sector school, or are you just at the schools public schools or private schools?
I focus on public schools.
Why?
Mostly because, well, one, that's because where most of the struggling students are, just with the way that the race and also class break in the United States works. Private schools are predominantly white and on grade level, and public schools are predominantly African American and other poor groups because you can't afford to send your child to Catholic school or private school. Those schools are also a little easier to work with because there's some pressure from the state because of accountability, as I mentioned, to figure out how to help the needs of these students. So they are more interested in working with researchers to try and fix it as a kind of proof to the district and to the state, like, look, we're working on these issues, we want to help these students, you know, Harvard's coming in to help us, so they're a little easier to work with in private schools as well.
Maybe a quick contribution to that is that also in US, the population she's targeting, let's say African American, most likely are in public school. Private school should be those who already have a kind of middle income, what we call middle class, and most of the time it's kind of difficult. So the majority should be in public school in the US context. Yes.
So I feel very weird, but so the description of discrimination, how discrimination is described. You talk mostly about the school environment, but sometimes it can be transmitted from parents to children. So, for instance, do you plan on surveying parents or see, for instance, what kind of parents' experience has been transmitted to children as a way to, in fact, have a handle of what kind of experience the children have? Now, another thing is externalities. I mean, for instance, many, like some of the African American children are basically more segregated than others. Segregation might be a factor. And also sometimes housing segregation, and also like income segregation could also play a role. And because capturing those externalities would be extremely interesting in the sense of see how transmission of those skills, not from teachers to, not from teachers to children, to students, but also from children to children, for instance, could also play a role in mitigating the problem.
So part of that is why I'm including a
Oh yeah, I forgot about something else. Accents, reaction to accents as an experience of discrimination, for instance.
Yes, okay. So with perceived discrimination, I think as I mentioned, one of the scales I want to use focuses on discrimination outside of the context of school. So that would capture things like I'm sometimes, never, frequently followed when I'm in a grocery store, like about conversations with their parents and also just how they feel in society. So that captures some of the out of school context. And then in terms of accent specifically, I know that is something that is very relevant in the American schooling system, especially with the context of African American students. Actually, many researchers will argue that African American vernacular English is its own dialect of English, its own grammatical structure, and so kids aren't speaking wrong, they're just speaking in like a different dialect. And so that we need to think about academic English as almost like English as a second language. And when we're trying to tell them, the way that you speak and the way that your parents speak, the way the community speaks is wrong, that then makes them ingrain a lot of shame about their community and who they are, rather than when students are coming from another country where they speak, let's say, Spanish, something like that. It's like, oh, well, you have this other language, we want to bring it into the classroom, things like that. So I think that that's not necessarily accent, but the kind of regional dialect differences is something that people want to pull in when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching. And yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let us give a big round.
Yeah, thank you. When I look at your consideration of reading assessment, I was just thinking about also building from what Leonard is raising, that when you talk about reading, there are different, for example, components of reading. And I'm imagining that perhaps you would be interested in also, whenever you are looking at the what are the proficiency that are exhibited by these learners, to pay attention to the different subcomponents of reading. Is it that they're deficient right away from the sounding, or segmentation, or oral reading? I mean, I think that can be more responsive when you perhaps think about how to intervene.
Yeah. So I'd say you're definitely right in that there are, so I'm most interested in adolescents, and so there are adolescent students that are still functionally literate, so they're like learning how to read. For a lot of adolescent students, they've built the different components of reading in terms of phonics and things like that, and then after, they say about the 4th grade reading level, that's when it really just becomes about the quantity that you're reading, and your ability to read more complex text moving forward. So there are definitely grade level standards that target that, but it's not as clean cut as it is in the younger grades of Jonathan is missing short I and he can't blend these two sounds together, or he does a lot of word deletions when he's reading something aloud. So it becomes a little bit less like math and a little more complicated when it moves into especially middle school and high school. And students are reading at the 6th grade reading level but are in the 11th grade, as opposed to being in the 3rd grade and not knowing how to read.
Thank you. Now we stay in education class. And we welcome.
Bonjour. Je m'appelle Kristia à Wantchekon. Je suis une étudiante à Harvard, à Boston, aux États-Unis.
Vous venez de présenter un exposé.
Oui.
Donnez-nous le titre de l'exposé, faites-nous une synthèse de votre communication.
Il faut que je le traduise. C'est l'impact de la discrimination sur la yeah. Motivation des étudiants noirs aux États-Unis.
Okay.
Oui.
Give us the summary of your communication.
I
Title of topic and
Yeah,
give us
the impact of discrimination on the motivation of African American students.
the summary, synthèse.
Oh, sorry. I think you said title.
Oui, vous faites la synthèse de...
Oh, sorry. Okay. Essentially, I was interested to see whether discrimination impacts the motivation of African American students in the United States, specifically in things that have to do with reading.
Maintenant, quels sont les avantages que vous pensez que votre communication aurait pu apporter à ces participants-là qui vous ont suivi?
I think it's helpful to learn about the American context because it's very different from the context here, and just give some insight into some of the issues that we're facing in our own society.
Okay, un mot de fin sur la suite.
I'm just very happy to be here. This is very much my dad's dream, so just happy to be here. I'm very encouraged by the work that I've seen so far.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Merci. Okay. Bonjour madame,
Bonjour,
présentez-vous.
je m'appelle Kristia Wantchekon et je suis une étudiante à Harvard aux États-Unis.
Ok, vous venez de présenter notre brillant exposé. Vous allez nous donner le titre et faire une synthèse de votre exposé.
Mon exposé, c'était sur la discrimination contre les enfants noirs aux États-Unis et comment cette expérience de discrimination affecte leur motivation, surtout dans les cours d'anglais et la littérature.
Détaillez-nous l'impact que ça pourrait avoir sur les enfants aux États-Unis là-bas.
Je pense qu'il reste beaucoup de questions quand on pense à comment on peut aider les enfants noirs et hispaniques aux États-Unis. Et pour la plupart des personnes, ou beaucoup de personnes pensent que c'est une question de culture et que les Noirs n'aiment pas travailler. Et moi, je pense que c'est en fait beaucoup plus compliqué et il faut qu'on fait face à le racisme qu'on voit aux États-Unis et l'affect que le racisme et la discrimination a sur ces enfants pour mieux comprendre comment on peut les aider.
Maintenant, votre mot de fin sur l'ASE.
Oui, je dirais que l'ASE, c'est le grand rêve de mon père. Donc, je suis vraiment ravie d'être ici et d'assister et de voir tous les étudiants parce qu'ils parlent tout le temps de l'ASE et tous les étudiants et parce que j'ai pas la chance d'être ici tout le temps, de vraiment voir ce qui se passe, ça me ferait très très heureuse et j'ai beaucoup d'espoir pour le futur.